You can go home and do push-ups and cartwheels and off and whatever the you want to do. I'm very glad you won that fight, man. But I'm not impressed by your performance, and I look forward to fight you.
Good evening and welcome back inside the cage here at the Real MMA today. It has been a couple of weeks since we have come to you guys live on a Wednesday evening, so want to welcome you guys back in to the Real MMA today. Of course, this is our UFC 146 preview show, a big heavyweight card coming up this Saturday night from the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada. Also, we're going to touch a little bit on what I think about the unfortunate news we've heard this last weekend with UFC light heavyweight champion Jon Jones unfortunately being picked up on suspicion of a DWI in his home state of New York. But always do want to get the business out of the way first. We have, of course, first follow us on Twitter. Just search The Real MMA today. You can always like us on our Facebook page where we have news breaking all the time, including pictures of the events that we have covered live in the cities that they came from. You can do so by searching facebook.com/The Real MMA today. You can always send us an email if you want to send us your picks for this weekend's UFC 146. You can do so at mmatoday@rocketmail.com. And if you want to give us a call this evening or any evening that we come to you live, you can do so by giving us a call at 347-324-3423. Now, like I said, I do, before I want to get into UFC 146 that'll be taking place this Saturday, did want to touch a little bit on my opinion of the whole Jon Jones incident that happened this last Saturday night. Unfortunately, it was something that I did not expect from Jon. I was a big supporter of Jon when there's been a lot of people come out and I guess you could call it hate or I really don't know what the words to put on it, but there's been a lot of negativity for the UFC light heavyweight champion here recently, and it's only going to compound, unfortunately, with his arrest. From what I understand, he's going to appear before a judge next Tuesday, May the 29th, and that'll be his official arraignment. At that point, they'll go over all the logistics of the trial. Then, from what I understand, late August, early September, he'll have to appear in court again, and that will be, when the prosecution gives him a plea bargain. If he decides to accept it, of course, there'll be no jail time. And if he does not decide to accept it, he'll then go to trial. But it's an unfortunate thing because, I thought we finally have found an athlete for the young people to really look up to, but I guess it pretty much points to the fact that we all are human. And I really don't know. I've been torn, as a Jon Jones fan personally, I've been torn these last few days on my feelings because at one point, I want to support him as being a fan of his, but on the other point, he made a huge mistake, and I guess only time will tell if he learns from this mistake, because that's the ultimate thing that he's going to have to do at this point, is he's going to have to learn from his mistake that he made, and hopefully he will learn from this, and maybe it'll bring more attention to drinking and driving, not only in the United States but globally, and the negative impact that it can have on people's lives, even if you don't get into an accident, even if you don't, unfortunately kill somebody in an accident, there's always negatively impacting, and I hope he does learn from that, and I hope that, he'll move on from that. But I do want to get into UFC 146. Let's get into a little bit of positive MMA news. It's going to be a barn burner because if anyone hasn't looked at the schedule for the full pay-per-view card of UFC 146, it's full of nothing but heavyweights. So we had, of course, the Strikeforce Grand Prix tournament come to an end this past Saturday with Daniel Cormier completely coming out of nowhere and beating Josh Barnett and winning that UFC Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix. Of course, now the heavyweight division will be coming over to Strikeforce, I believe, over from Strikeforce to the UFC. I believe both of those guys may have one more fight over in Strikeforce before they come over. But now the heavyweights and the top heavyweights in the world will be in the UFC. And to start all of that off, UFC 146 is going to be full of 5 heavyweight fights. So the full pay-per-view card will be full of heavyweights on that card. But looking at that card, getting ready for this evening, I was excited for the FX prelims portion. I think I've ever been excited for the FX portion prelims because you're going to have names as Jacob Volcom, Dan the Outlaw Hardy, of course, a friend of the show, Dwayne Ludwig. You're going to have Jason Mayhem Miller. You're going to have undefeated Edison Barboza. And you're going to have Diego Brandao, of course, who won the Ultimate Fighter not too long ago. But we're going to walk you through all of the 5 fights on the pay-per-view portion, then all of the fights on the prelim portion. Now, in case you didn't know, you'll also get 2 fights on Facebook before they come on to FX. We won't go into detail of those, but if you do want to know, that's Mike Brown versus Daniel Pineda and Kyle Kingsbury versus Glover Teixeira. So both of those fights will be on the Facebook prelim portion of the card. But the first fight we're going to get into this evening is Jacob Volcom versus Paul Sass. Now, Jacob, of course, is a lightweight. He comes out of Fergus Falls, Minnesota. He has an MMA record of 14-2. He's 5-2 in the UFC. His last fight, he beat Efren Escudero at UFC 141 back in December 30th of last year. Paul Sass is from England. He is 12-0 in his MMA career. He is 2-0 in the UFC with wins over Mark Hoist and Michael Johnson. Now, of course, that Michael Johnson victory looks a lot better after Michael Johnson's last fight he had. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit differently because before, when I got into preview shows, I already had who I was going to win, and I kind of just didn't. I kind of did the legwork ahead of time. But tonight, I'm going to do it on the fly because I want to go basically my first gut instinct of who's going to win. So I'm going to try that. See if I can't get a better outcome this weekend because these last couple cards have struggled a bit, so I'm going to hopefully come out a little bit better this weekend. Now, I should pick Jacob Volcom just off of his nickname because he goes by Jacob Christmas Volcom. Now, that should give me a lot, but I'm going to go with Paul Sass in this one. You know, he's 12-0. His opponents have been kind of suspect. Jacob has beaten the likes of Danny Castillo, and of course, I did mention Efren Escudero. But I'm going to go with Paul Sass with this one. He's submitted both of his opponents that he's fought in the UFC, and I think this is going to be another submission. I think it's going to be a second-round submission for Paul Sass on Saturday night. Now, one of the fights that I've been looking forward to most on the entire card is the next card we're going to go over. It's Dan the Outlaw Hardy versus Dwayne Bang Ludwig. Of course, Dwayne joined us back in January. He also joined us just a few weeks ago a little bit to discuss his matchup with Dan Hardy. He basically, has said this is a big fight for him, and I agree. I think this is a big fight for both of these guys. I think if Dan Hardy loses this one, I think, losing 5 in a row, I don't think there's any way he can possibly continue to fight in the UFC. So I think this is a very, very important fight for Dan the Outlaw Hardy. Of course, Dwayne Ludwig lost his last fight, UFC on Fox against Josh Neer back in January 20th of this current year. But Dan Hardy comes into this fight at 23-10 with 1 no contest. He's got a 4-4 UFC record. Of course, he's now training with Frank Mir, who will be in the main event on this card. But he has lost his last 4 fights. Of course, you can't really complain. It's been to George St. Pierre, Carlos Condit. The only one you could kind of scratch your head a little bit with was Anthony Rumble Johnson back in March of last year. And he also lost to Chris Lytle, which was his last fight in August of last year. Now, Dwayne Ludwig, like I said, He's coming into this fight at 29-12. He has a 4-3 UFC record. He's, of course, training with the likes of Brendan Schaub and Mike Dolce and Nate Marquardt up in Colorado. So I know he's basically has said that he's going to be a new fighter coming into this fight. When I had a chance to talk to him, he is 2-3 in his last 3 fights. He beat Amir Sadallah back in August of last year, but like I said, he lost his last fight to Josh Neer in January. I honestly think you don't want to close your eyes in this fight because we both know both of these guys are going to come out swinging. They both have already said that. I got a feeling Duane Ludwig is going to come out and win this one. I think it's a very important fight for Duane, and I know a lot of people are going to be saying, well, you know, you're getting Duane Ludwig bias, and I understand that. Maybe I am to a certain point, but I like Duane Ludwig in this fight, and I like him with a first-round knockout of Dan Hardy. I just don't see Dan Hardy being the same fighter since that loss to George St. Pierre back at UFC 111 in March of 2010. So I like Duane Ludwig in that one. The next fight is another important fight on the card because it's Jason Mayhem Miller versus CB Dollaway. Now, both of these guys have lost, the last couple of fights. Of course, Mayhem is from my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. He's 34-9 with 1 no contest. He's got an 0-2 UFC record. Now, those 2 fights in the UFC have been very spaced apart. Of course, he fought George St. Pierre back at UFC 52 in April of 2005. And then his last fight, he lost at the Ultimate Fighter 14 finale to Michael Bisping in what a lot of people thought was a abysmal performance by Jason Mayhem Miller. CB Dollaway is coming off 2 losses of his own. He is 12-5 in MMA. He is 5-4 in the UFC. Of course, he's training with the likes of Ryan Bader and Aaron Simpson. His last fight, he lost at UFC Live back in August of last year to Jared Heyman. I think Jason Mayhem Miller, of course, he went over to Europe and started training a little bit over there before this fight, trying to clear his head a little bit, and I think that's going to work for him. I like Jason to submit CB Dollaway in the second round of this one. I just think we're going to see a different Jason Mayhem Miller than we saw against Michael Bisping. Of course, Michael Bisping has now become one of the top middleweights in the UFC, and I think CB Dollaway is a huge drop-off from what Jason Mayhem Miller saw with Michael Bisping. So I think you're going to see Jason Mayhem Miller, who I think is between the ladder of CB Dollaway and Michael Bisping. So I think you're going to see that in this fight. But I like Jason Mayhem Miller to win this one by a second-round submission. Then it's going to be Edison Barboza versus Jamie Varner. Now, of course, Barboza, who's now fighting out of Jupiter, Florida, is originally from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He is 10-0 in his MMA career. He's got a 4-0 UFC record. His last fight, he looked very impressive with a round 3 KO of Terry Edom back at UFC 142 in January. He also beat Ross Pearson back at UFC 134 in August by a split decision. Jamie Varner, of course, he's fighting out of Dobson Shores, Arizona. He is 19-6-1 with 2 no contests, and he's 1-1 in the UFC. Of course, he fought over in the WEC for a while as well before WEC and the UFC combined. He won his last fight back at UFC 68. Now, this is his last fight since UFC 68. He was actually fighting in smaller promotions, but he got this call to face Edison Barboza. His last fight in the UFC, of course, like I said, was a win back at UFC 68 in March of 2007. I just think it's kind of Jamie Varner, the veteran, versus Edison Barboza, the up-and-comer, and I really, really like Edison Barboza in this one. I think he's going to completely dominate, and I'd like a first-round knockout from Edison Barboza. Then the last fight on the FX portion of this card will be Diego Brandao versus Darren Elkins. Of course, Diego Brandao, he's fighting with Jackson MMA in Albuquerque. He is 19-7. He's 1-0 in the UFC. He, of course, beat Dennis Bermudez back at the Ultimate Fighter 14 finale by submission in the first round in December of last year. That's been his only fight under the Zuffa banner. Darren Elkins is coming into this fight at 14-2. He's 3-1 in the UFC. And I guess we're going to kind of see, of course, Darren Elkins' big win on his record was a win over Dwayne Ludwig back in March of 2010. I think we're going to kind of see what Diego Brandao is made of, and I really think he's going to be a special talent in the UFC, and I think we're going to see that here. I really like Diego Brandao in this one, and I like him big in this one. I like him by a first-round submission over Darren Elkins. You know, we're kind of going to see where Diego Brandao stays in the featherweight division in the UFC. You know, at 24 years old, he's obviously an up-and-comer, you know, training with Greg Jackson and Mike Winkeljohn back at Jackson's MMA. He's really got a lot up and coming for him, and I really like Diego Brandao and what we're going to see from him, not just in this fight, but in the future down the road. Then, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 7 out in Pacific Time, it's going to be UFC 146, the main pay-per-view card. Nothing but heavyweights from here on out. So this could be the fastest pay-per-view card that the UFC has ever had. It's going to start off with Stefan Skyscraper Struve versus LeVar Big Johnson. Of course, Stefan Struve, age 24. He seems a lot older than that. I mean, I don't know if it's just me, but it sure seems like he's been around for a long time. But he's actually on a 2-fight winning streak and won 4 of his last 5 fights. He's 27-5 in his MMA career. He's 7-3 in the UFC. His last fight, he actually beat Dave Herman in what was a great fight, UFC on Fuel back in February. And then but the fight before that, he beat Pat Barry at UFC Live back in October of last year. So he's had 2 really good wins. His only loss over his last 5 fights was to Travis Brown back at UFC 130 in May of last year. Now, LeVar Big Johnson, I mean, you really got to give it to LeVar because he just fought May the 5th against Pat Barry. He is 17-5 in his MMA career. He's 2-0 in the UFC. Of course, he fought for Strikeforce before that. But you really got to give it to LeVar Big Johnson because I'll tell you what, he fought Pat Barry back in May, and then he fought Joey Beltran back in January. So he's already fought twice on this calendar year. And not only that, but he fought not even a month ago against Pat Barry, and he's willing to take on Stefan Struve. I guess he's going to go right back into camp, and he's fighting Stefan Struve. And I really liked LeVar Johnson in this one. I saw a lot from LeVar Johnson in that Pat Barry fight that I didn't know LeVar Johnson had personally. And I know Stefan Struve said he's been studying more of LeVar Johnson's losses in Strikeforce than he has against his 2 wins here in the UFC. But I really like LeVar Johnson to win this one by second-round knockout. Like I said, this could be the fastest pay-per-view card that the UFC's ever seen, and this could start it off with this one with LeVar Johnson winning by second-round knockout. Then it's Stipe Miocic versus Shane Del Rosario. Now, of course, Miocic, his birthplace was actually in Ohio, and he's 8-0 in his MMA career. He's 2-0 in the UFC. You know, he fought Joey Beltran back in October, and then, of course, he won his last fight back in February with a 43-second knockout of Phil DeFries. Now, Shane Del Rosario, he'll be making his UFC debut. He is 11-0 in MMA, so both of these guys, you know, undefeated, so one of the O's have got to go, I guess, in this one. But I really look for knockout in this one, but I like Del Rosario. I really like him by first-round knockout. Something's just telling me go with Shane Del Rosario in this one, and I really think he is going to come out in this one and really show a lot of things. You know, a lot of times they get those octagon butterflies, so we'll have to see if Del Rosario gets those, but I really like him in this one. Then it's Roy Big Country Nelson versus Dave Herman. Now, Roy, of course, he is 17-7 in his MMA career. He's 3-3 in the UFC, but he's really fought nothing but top competition since joining the UFC. He's got wins over Brendan Schaub, Stefan Struve, and Mirko Krokop, but he's got losses to the champion Junior Dos Santos, the number 1 contender Frank Mir, and Fabricio Verdum, who was also in that discussion when Alistair Overeem got taken out of that fight. So he's done nothing but fight the top competition in the UFC has Roy Nelson. Now, Dave Herman comes into this fight at 21-3. He is 1-1 in the UFC. Of course, he lost that fight back to Stefan Struve back in February on UFC on Fuel. And I really, really, really like Roy Nelson. If there's ever been a lock on a card, I really like Roy Nelson in this one. He's coming off that loss to UFC 143, and I think he's really going to put down the hammer on Dave Herman. Maybe try to even take him to the ground. I know we haven't seen a lot of that from Roy Nelson, but I really like Roy Nelson by first-round knockout in this one. Then it's the co-main event of the evening. It's going to be Cain Velasquez versus Antonio Bigfoot Silva. Cain Velasquez comes into this one at 9-1. He is 7-1 in the UFC. Of course, Antonio Bigfoot Silva is coming over from Strikeforce. He is 16-3 in his MMA career. This will be his UFC debut. Now, of course, Cain Velasquez coming off that loss to Junior Dos Santos at the first ever UFC on Fox back in November of last year. And what was an unbelievable knockout by Junior Dos Santos. So we're going to have to see how Cain Velasquez is going to turn things around and see how he can do it. But he's really fought another top-line competition with Big Nog, Brock Lesnar, like I said, the aforementioned Junior Dos Santos. Now, Antonio Silva, not no slouch himself. He, of course, brought down the legend that is Fedor Emelianenko. So we're going to have to really see on this one. But I think Cain Velasquez is going to come out, and that's going to be another first-round knockout. I think Cain Velasquez is really going to show a lot in this fight, and I like Cain Velasquez in this one. Then the main event of the evening is Junior Dos Santos versus Frank Mir for the heavyweight championship. Junior Dos Santos is coming in this one as the champion at 14-1. He has an 8-0 UFC record. He, of course, last fight was against Cain Velasquez back in UFC on Fox with that knockout that I was talking about earlier. Frank Mir is going to be in his hometown like he normally is in Las Vegas, Nevada. He's coming in with an MMA record of 16-5. He is 14-5 in the UFC. He has won 3 straight over Mirko Kokop, Roy Nelson, and that ugly submission win that he had over Big Nog, breaking Big Nog's arm, which was one of the most brutal submissions the UFC has ever seen. And I'm going to be honest with you. I've gone back and forth in this fight. You know, one moment I say Junior Dos Santos, one minute I say Frank Mir. I'm going to go with Frank Mir as an upset in this one. I think he's going to be able to take Junior Dos Santos to the ground. Now, the only question I have in Frank Mir is, can he take a real punch? That's the only real question I have of Frank Mir. And if he can prove Saturday night that he can take a punch, he will win the UFC Heavyweight Championship for a third time. Because what he's going to have to do is he's going to have to, take Junior Dos Santos' initial blow, because we know Junior Dos Santos will come after him early. And if he can take that early blow in the first round, I really like Frank Mir the longer this fight goes. And I think Frank Mir will end up winning this one by a third-round submission victory. I think he's going to have to tire Junior Dos Santos down a little bit. And I really like Frank Mir by submission, because we all seen what happens. If he gets pushed against a wall, there's always a chance that Frank Mir can pull something out, just like he did against Brock Lesnar the first time. So I think at the end of the night, Frank Mir will be the new UFC heavyweight champion. That will wrap up our show for this evening. I do appreciate everyone for listening like always. Please follow us on Facebook. Please just go to our Facebook page, hit facebook.com/TheRealMMA Today. You can always follow us on Twitter. Just search The Real MMA Today. If you want to email me your picks for the fight Saturday night, you can do so at mmatoday@rocketmail.com. And if you ever want to give us a call, I'm always welcome to people giving us a call. I know these last few weeks, it's been kind of crazy. We haven't been on for 2 weeks, and then we're coming with a preview show. But if you ever want to give us a call, you can do so at area code 347-324-3423. I hope everybody has a great weekend. Enjoy the fights, and we'll see you back here next Wednesday to talk about what happened Saturday night at UFC 146. So long, everybody.